Hey guys, tonight we're trading Roman sandals for Egyptian sand and swapping Latin curses for hieroglyphic nightmares. We're diving deep into the brutal reality of building the Great Pyramid of Giza, where your career prospects included heat stroke, crushed limbs, and the exciting opportunity to die anonymously for Pharaoh's Eternal Vanity project. So before we get started, smash that like button if you enjoy these deep dives into historical misery. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about why the past was absolutely terrible. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our global audience of masochists who apparently enjoy learning about ancient suffering. Now grab something cold to drink, maybe turn on that AC, and let's journey back to when building codes were suggestions and workplace safety was a concept that wouldn't be invented for another 4,000 years. So, you think you could have handled being a pyramid builder? That's precious. Like thinking you could survive a construction job where the safety equipment was prayer and the retirement plan was death. So you thought being a pyramid builder was glamorous. You imagined chiseling away at eternal monuments while the pharaoh personally thanked you for your artistic vision. Maybe you pictured yourself as some ancient architect, respected by history, your name carved in hieroglyphs for millennia to come. Well, congratulations on having the historical awareness of a particularly optimistic sand flea. Let's start with the obvious: you weren't building just any pyramid. You were building the Great Pyramid of Giza, a monument so stupidly massive that even today, engineers look at it and wonder if the ancient Egyptians had access to alien technology or just an unlimited supply of human misery. Spoiler alert, it was the misery. The Great Pyramid wasn't some weekend DIY project that got out of hand. This was a 2.3 million block limestone nightmare that took over 20 years to complete. 20 years. That's longer than most marriages, longer than most civilizations, and definitely longer than your will to live, once you realized what you'd signed up for. But first, let's talk about how you ended up in this sandy hell in the first place. You didn't wake up one morning and think, you know what sounds fun? Moving 2.5-ton blocks of stone in the desert heat until I die. No, you were probably a farmer whose crops failed, a craftsman whose business went under, or just some poor bastard who lived too close to Memphis when the pharaoh's labor recruiters came calling. The recruiters didn't knock politely. They showed up with scrolls, official seals, and the subtle implication that refusing the pharaoh's generous employment opportunity might result in you becoming intimately acquainted with their bronze axes. They called it corvée labor, which sounds sophisticated until you realize it's just fancy Egyptian for mandatory unpaid work that will probably kill you. If you were lucky enough to be a skilled craftsman, a mason or carpenter, you might have volunteered. The pay was decent, the food was regular, and working on the pharaoh's eternal resting place carried a certain prestige. You'd be working alongside the best craftsmen in Egypt, creating something that would outlast empires. What could go wrong? Everything. Literally everything could go wrong. Let's start with the commute. You didn't live on the Giza Plateau. Nobody lived on the Giza Plateau because it was a wind-swept limestone wasteland that made the Sahara look hospitable. You lived in the workers' village, a cramped collection of mud, brick barracks that housed the approximately 20,000 workers needed to keep this monument to royal ego moving forward. The workers' village was exactly as luxurious as it sounds. Imagine a prison designed by someone who thought prisoners were getting too much personal space. You shared a room with 11 other men, sleeping on reed mats that provided all the comfort of lying directly on stone, which, coincidentally, you'd be doing plenty of during your working hours. Your roommates were a delightful collection of humanity's finest cunti, who snored like a hippopotamus with bronchitis, Amenhotep, who never met a garlic bulb he didn't want to befriend, and Senib, who had developed the charming habit of talking in his sleep about all the ways the pyramid construction was going to kill him. Spoiler, he wasn't wrong. The wake-up call came at dawn, delivered by foremen who had apparently trained under professional military torturers. Sleep was a luxury you abandoned the moment you agreed to build eternity's most expensive tomb. The workday started before the sun rose and ended well after it set, because apparently even the sun god Ra thought this project was taking too long. Breakfast was a chunk of bread that had the consistency of limestone and beer that tasted like the Nile had been used as a communal bath. The bread was your primary source of nutrition, assuming you could gnaw through it without breaking your teeth. The beer was weak, warm, and your only reliable source of calories that didn't require industrial, strength jaw muscles to consume. After this gourmet feast, you'd grab your tools and head out to the plateau. The walk from the village to the worksite was about a mile, which doesn't sound like much until you're doing it while carrying bronze chisels, wooden mallets, copper saws, and various other implements designed to turn solid stone into slightly differently shaped solid stone. The Giza Plateau in summer was hot enough to cook meat on the limestone. The temperature regularly reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was in the shade, of which there was precisely none. The pyramid rose from the desert like a geometric middle finger pointed at the sun, and you were expected to climb all over it, hauling massive blocks of stone, while wearing nothing but a linen kilt that provided about as much protection from the elements as wishful thinking. Winter wasn't much better. Desert nights were cold enough to freeze the beer in your cup, and the limestone blocks became so cold that touching them bare-handed would leave skin behind. The wind whipped across the plateau with enough force to knock a grown man off the pyramid's face, which happened more often than the foreman liked to admit, and far more often than you wanted to think about. But the weather was the least of your problems. Your real enemy was the stone itself. Each block of the Great Pyramid weighed between 2 and 15 tons. To put that in perspective, the average car today weighs about 2 tons. You were moving the equivalent of cars, except these cars were made of solid limestone, had no wheels, and needed to be lifted several hundred feet into the air using nothing but ropes, ramps, and the raw application of human suffering. The limestone came from quarries south of the pyramid site, and moving it required a level of coordination that would make modern logistics experts weep. The blocks were loaded onto wooden sleds and dragged by teams of workers across the desert. If you were assigned to a hauling crew, congratulations. Your job was to spend 12 hours a day pulling stone sleds across sand and rock, while foremen shouted encouragement like, "Move faster, or I'll have you flogged." And that block isn't going to drag itself. The ropes used for hauling were made of papyrus fiber, which sounds organic and sustainable until you realize that papyrus rope has a tendency to snap under extreme tension, usually when you're directly underneath whatever it was holding up. Rope failure was a common cause of death on the pyramid construction site, along with falling blocks, heat stroke, falling off the pyramid, being crushed by rollers, falling into the pyramid, tool accidents, and various other occupational hazards that didn't exist in more sensible professions like crocodile wrestling. If you weren't on a hauling crew, you might be part of a lifting gang, which was arguably worse. The pyramid was built using a system of ramps that spiraled around the outside of the structures as it rose. These ramps were marvels of engineering that allowed massive stone blocks to be dragged up to incredible heights, using nothing but human muscle power and determination. The ramps were also death traps that claimed workers on a daily basis. Dragging a 15-ton block up a narrow ramp that rose at a 12-degree angle required perfect coordination between dozens of workers. One person stumbling, one rope fraying, one moment of inattention, and the entire block could come sliding back down the ramp, taking out anyone unlucky enough to be in its path. The foreman called these incidents setbacks. The workers called them reasons to fake sick and hide in the barracks. But let's say you were skilled enough to avoid the hauling and lifting crews. Maybe you were a stone dresser, responsible for shaping the rough quarry blocks into the precisely fitted pieces that would form the pyramid's courses. This sounds like skilled, respectable work, and it was, right up until you realized what it actually involved. Stone dressing meant spending 10 to 12 hours a day hunched over limestone blocks, using bronze chisels and wooden mallets to chip away tiny fragments of stone. Your hands would be raw and bleeding within the first week. Your back would be permanently bent by the second month, and your hearing would be permanently damaged by the constant pounding of mallet on chisel on stone. The precision required was maddening. The Great Pyramid's blocks fit together so tightly that you can't slide a knife blade between them. This wasn't achieved through some lost ancient technology. It was accomplished through thousands of hours of painstaking work by craftsmen who spent their days making tiny adjustments to blocks that weighed more than elephants. And if your measurements were off, if your block didn't fit perfectly, you started over. There was no close enough when building eternity's most expensive monument. The pharaoh wasn't going to spend the afterlife in a pyramid with sloppy stonework, and the consequences of disappointing a god king were significantly worse than just being fired. The inside of the pyramid was its own special kind of nightmare. The internal chambers and passages were carved directly into the bedrock and built into the structure as it rose. Working inside meant crawling through narrow, pitch-black passages while carrying tools and dressed stone blocks. The air was stale and filled with stone dust that would coat your lungs and eventually kill you through what we now know as silicosis, but which the ancient Egyptians just called the cough that kills quarrymen. The Grand Gallery, the pyramid's most impressive internal feature, was a masterpiece of engineering that required workers to install precisely fitted granite blocks while suspended in a narrow corridor nearly 30 feet high. One slip, one moment of dizziness, and you'd fall to your death on the stone floor below. The echo would remind your fellow workers that their safety margins were approximately zero. The pyramid's internal chambers were accessed through passages so narrow that most workers had to crawl on their hands and knees while carrying tools and materials. The descending passage, which leads from the pyramid's entrance to the subterranean chamber, is barely 4 feet high and just as wide. Imagine spending your workday crawling through a limestone tunnel that was designed by someone who apparently thought human beings were much smaller and more flexible than they actually are. The ascending passages weren't any better. The Grand Gallery, for all its architectural glory, was essentially a giant stone chute that workers had to navigate while carrying heavy materials. The angle was steep enough that a dropped tool could easily kill someone below, and the polished limestone offered about as much traction as ice. Working on the pyramid's exterior wasn't much safer. The outer casing was made of polished Tura limestone that gleamed white in the Egyptian sun and was slippery enough to send workers tumbling to their deaths on a regular basis. The casing blocks had to be fitted with the same precision as the interior stones, which meant workers spent their days hanging off the side of a 450-foot-tall monument, chiseling away at blocks while suspended by papyrus ropes and hope. The pyramid's angle of inclination was 51 degrees, 52 minutes, and 14 seconds. This precise angle wasn't chosen because it looked nice. It was the steepest angle at which the limestone blocks would remain stable. This also meant that it was steep enough to kill anyone who fell off, which happened with depressing regularity. Safety equipment consisted of whatever you could improvise from available materials. There were no hard hats, no safety harnesses, no full protection systems. If you were working at height, your safety depended on your own balance, the quality of the rope, and the favor of the gods. The gods, it should be noted, seemed to have mixed feelings about pyramid construction. The tools you worked with were primitive by any reasonable standard. Bronze chisels that dulled quickly against hard stone, wooden mallets that split under constant use, copper saws that bent when used on granite, dolerite pounders, which were just really hard rocks used to pound on slightly less hard rocks. Your most advanced piece of equipment was probably the plumb line, which was exactly as sophisticated as it sounds, a weight on a string. Sharpening and maintaining these tools was a constant battle. Bronze was expensive and had to be recycled when tools broke or wore out. The toolmakers worked around the clock to keep the workforce equipped, but there were never enough sharp chisels to go around. A dull chisel meant working twice as hard to achieve the same result, and working twice as hard in the Egyptian heat was often the difference between surviving the day and becoming another casualty of Pharaoh's ambition. The copper tools were particularly frustrating. Copper is soft, which made it relatively easy to work into the shapes needed for specialized tasks, but it also meant the tools deformed under heavy use. A copper saw would start the day sharp and straight and end it curved and worthless. The constant need to repair and replace tools meant that a significant portion of the workforce was devoted not to building the pyramid, but to building the tools needed to build the pyramid. Water was another constant problem. The human body needs about a gallon of water per day under normal conditions. Working 12-hour shifts in the desert heat while hauling massive stone blocks is not normal conditions. Workers needed 2 to 3 gallons of water daily just to avoid dying of dehydration. And getting that much water to the work site required a logistical effort that rivaled the pyramid construction itself. Water had to be carried up from the Nile in clay pots, a journey of several miles each way. The water carriers were mostly women and children from the workers' families, and they made multiple trips daily to keep the workforce hydrated. The water was stored in large clay jars at various points around the work site, but it was always warm, often muddy, and frequently contaminated with whatever had died upstream. Beer was safer to drink than water, but it was also heavier to transport and more expensive to produce. The workers received a daily ration of beer, but it was weak stuff, barely alcoholic enough to kill harmful bacteria. It tasted about as good as you'd expect from something made primarily for its disinfectant properties. Food was another daily struggle. The workers needed massive amounts of calories to fuel their labor, but transporting and preparing food for 20,000 people in the middle of the desert required an army of cooks, bakers, and supply personnel. The primary food was bread, baked in large outdoor ovens that turned the workers' village into a smoky, flour-dusted hellscape. The bread was coarse, gritty, and often full of sand that would wear down your teeth over time. Dental problems were endemic among pyramid builders, not just from the sandy bread, but from the stone dust that filled the air and got into everything, including your food. Archaeological evidence from pyramid workers shows teeth worn down to nubs, infected gums, and jaw problems that must have made eating agony. Meat was a luxury reserved for skilled craftsmen and foremen. Most workers survived on bread, beer, onions, and garlic, with the occasional handful of dates or figs when available. The onions and garlic weren't just for flavor, they were believed to provide strength and ward off disease. Whether they actually worked is debatable, but they certainly made the already cramped sleeping quarters even more aromatic. The work schedule was relentless. There were no weekends, no vacation days, no sick leave. You worked until the pyramid was finished, you died, or you became too injured to continue. The only breaks in the routine were the religious festivals, when work stopped so the workers could participate in ceremonies honoring the gods, who were presumably watching over the construction project. These festivals were the only times workers could rest, celebrate, and temporarily forget that they were slowly being killed by the pharaoh's monument. The medical care available to workers was primitive even by ancient standards. The Egyptians had developed some sophisticated medical knowledge, but most of it was reserved for the wealthy. Pyramid workers made do with whatever remedies the village healers could provide using available plants, and a profound optimism about the healing power of prayer. Broken bones were set with wooden splints and linen bandages, assuming you survived the accident that caused them. Cuts and scrapes were cleaned with honey if it was available, or just left to heal on their own if it wasn't. Serious injuries often meant death, not from the injury itself, but from the infections that inevitably followed. Heat stroke was a constant danger during the summer months. Workers would collapse from the heat and dehydration, and the treatment was to drag them into whatever shade could be found and pour lukewarm water over them until they either recovered or died. There was no understanding of electrolyte balance or the physiology of heat exhaustion. You either got better on your own or you didn't. The stone dust that filled the air caused respiratory problems that got worse over time. Workers developed chronic coughs, difficulty breathing, and eventually what we now know as silicosis, a fatal lung disease caused by inhaling silica particles. The ancient Egyptians had no understanding of occupational lung disease. They just noticed that quarrymen and stone workers tended to die young with breathing problems. Injuries from falling blocks, tool accidents, and falls from height were treated with whatever techniques the healers had learned from previous patients. Crushed limbs were amputated without anesthesia if gangrene set in. Head injuries were treated with prayers and hope. Spinal injuries usually meant a lingering death, since there was no understanding of paralysis or how to care for patients who couldn't move. The psychological toll of pyramid construction was perhaps worse than the physical hardships. You were spending your entire adult life building a tomb for someone who would never acknowledge your existence, let alone thank you for your sacrifice. The pharaoh was a distant figure who appeared occasionally to inspect progress, surrounded by officials and guards who treated the workers like dangerous animals that needed to be kept under control. The work was repetitive to the point of madness. Day after day, year after year, you did exactly the same tasks: move block, shape block, lift block, place block. The only variation was which part of your body would hurt most on any given day. The skilled craftsmen at least had some variety in their work, but the labourers faced decades of identical back-breaking routine. The knowledge that you were building something that would outlast civilization was supposed to provide comfort and meaning, but mostly it just emphasized how insignificant your individual contribution was. You were one of thousands of interchangeable workers whose names would never be recorded, whose sacrifices would never be remembered. The pyramid would stand for millennia, but no one would know or care that you had given your life to build it. The foreman understood the psychological dangers of the work and tried to maintain morale through a combination of threats, promises, and group identity. Workers were organized into gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, which sounds festive until you realize these were just ways to make the workers feel like they were part of something larger than themselves while still being completely expendable. Competition between gangs was encouraged, with rewards for the crews that moved the most blocks or completed their sections fastest. The rewards were usually extra food rations or a day of rest. Nothing that would actually improve your long-term prospects, but enough to keep you working harder than the gang next to you. The religious aspect of the work was constantly emphasized. You weren't just building a tomb. You were creating a pathway for the pharaoh to join the gods in the afterlife, ensuring the continued prosperity of Egypt and the favor of the deities. This was supposed to make the work meaningful and sacred, but it was hard to feel spiritual when you were slowly dying from stone dust inhalation and chronic malnutrition. The pharaoh's divinity was never questioned, at least not openly. Khufu was the son of Ra, the god of the sun, and his pyramid was more than just a tomb. It was a religious structure that would guarantee his successful journey to the afterlife. Questioning the necessity of the pyramid or the methods used to build it wasn't just insubordination, it was blasphemy punishable by death. But privately, workers had plenty of questions. Why did a god need such an elaborate tomb? Why couldn't the pharaoh's divine power be used to build the pyramid without human suffering? Why did the gods demand such enormous sacrifices from people who would never benefit from the pharaoh's successful afterlife journey? These questions were never spoken aloud, but they hung in the air like the stone dust that filled everyone's lungs. The social hierarchy on the construction site was rigid and merciless. At the top were the architects and master craftsmen, educated men who lived in comfortable quarters and ate meat regularly. Below them were the skilled worker stonecutters, masons, carpenters, and metalworkers. These men had some job security and slightly better living conditions, but they were still expendable if they couldn't keep up with the demands of the project. At the bottom were the labourers, the men who hauled blocks and mixed mortar, and did all the back-breaking work that required no skill beyond the ability to lift heavy objects and follow simple orders. These were the workers who died in the greatest numbers, who suffered the worst injuries, who lived in the most cramped conditions, and ate the poorest food. Social mobility was theoretically possible but practically non-existent. A labourer could theoretically work his way up to skilled craftsman if he showed aptitude and survived long enough to learn new skills. But the physical demands of labouring work aged men quickly, and few had the strength or health to transition to skilled trades after years of hauling stone blocks. The skilled craftsmen guarded their knowledge jealously, partly out of professional pride, but mostly out of economic necessity. Teaching your skills to too many people meant more competition for the better paying jobs. The master craftsmen passed their knowledge to their sons or carefully selected apprentices, maintaining family dynasties that controlled access to the most desirable positions. The overseers and foremen were drawn from the ranks of former soldiers and minor officials, Men who had proven their ability to control large groups of workers through a combination of organization and intimidation. They carried wooden staves and bronze daggers, not just as symbols of authority, but as practical tools for maintaining discipline among workers who had little to lose. Discipline was swift and brutal. Minor infractions like showing up late or working too slowly resulted in reduced food rations or extra work assignments. More serious offenses like theft, fighting, or refusing orders were punished with public floggings that served as object lessons for the rest of the workforce. The most serious crime was attempting to escape. Workers who tried to leave the project before completion were hunted down by professional trackers and brought back to face punishment that was designed to be memorable. Public executions were rare but not unknown, particularly for workers who tried to incite others to abandon the project. But escape was almost impossible anyway. The pyramid construction site was isolated in the desert, miles from the nearest settlement. Workers had no money, no transportation, and no marketable skills outside of stone hauling. Even if you successfully left the site, where would you go? Your family depended on your wages, such as they were, and abandoning the project meant abandoning them to starvation. The wages were another source of constant frustration. Skilled craftsmen received payment in bread, beer, and cloth, along with occasional bonuses of meat or precious objects. Labourers received subsistence rations that were barely enough to keep them alive and working. There was no retirement plan, no pension, no provision for workers who became too old or injured to continue. The concept of workers' rights didn't exist. You worked until you couldn't work anymore, and then you died. If you were lucky, your family might receive a small payment to help with your burial expenses. If you were unlucky, your body was buried in an unmarked grave in the workers' cemetery, just another casualty of the pharaoh's eternal ambitions. The workers' cemetery has been excavated by modern archaeologists, and the remains tell a grim story. Skeletal remains show evidence of chronic malnutrition, arthritis, spinal compression from heavy lifting, and numerous healed fractures. The average life expectancy for pyramid workers was probably around 35 years, assuming you survived the first few years of work. Women in the workers' village had their own set of hardships. They were responsible for cooking, cleaning, child care, and water transport, all while living in the same overcrowded, unsanitary conditions as the male workers. Childbirth in the desert village was dangerous under the best circumstances, and the high infant mortality rate meant that women spent much of their lives pregnant or grieving. The children who grew up in the workers' village faced a grim future. Boys would eventually join the workforce, probably starting with light duties like water carrying or tool maintenance, before graduating to the full horror of block hauling. Girls would marry young and begin the cycle of pregnancy and child rearing that defined women's lives in ancient Egypt. Education was not available to workers' children. Reading and writing were skills reserved for the scribes and officials who managed the project, not for the people who actually built it. Children learned whatever trades their fathers practiced, assuming their fathers survived long enough to teach them anything useful. The constant presence of death shaped every aspect of life in the workers' village. People died from accidents, disease, exhaustion, heat stroke, and simple malnutrition. The village maintained a small temple where families could pray for their dead and make offerings to ensure safe passage to the afterlife, assuming workers could afford afterlives of their own. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The workers were building the most elaborate tomb in human history while living in conditions that made their own deaths cheap and forgettable. The pharaoh's afterlife was being purchased with thousands of anonymous deaths, each one representing a life cut short by the demands of royal eternity. Religious ceremonies were conducted regularly to maintain morale and reinforce the sacred nature of the work. Priests blessed the workers, the tools, and the stone blocks, invoking the protection of various gods and goddesses. These ceremonies provided some comfort to workers who desperately needed to believe their suffering had meaning beyond simple royal vanity. The gods invoked most frequently were those associated with construction and protection: Ptah, the creator god and patron of craftsmen; Khnum, who shaped human beings on his potter's wheel; and Sobek, the crocodile god who was thought to provide strength and protection. Workers made small offerings to these deities, usually bread or beer, hoping for divine intervention to prevent accidents or ease their suffering. But the god who received the most prayers was probably Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing, who was believed to record the deeds of the dead. Workers hoped that their sacrifices in building the pyramid would be recorded in Thoth's books, ensuring them a place in the afterlife despite their humble status in life. The seasonal changes brought different challenges to pyramid construction. The annual flooding of the Nile, which normally brought prosperity to Egyptian farmers, created additional complications for the construction project. The flood season made transportation difficult and created humidity that made working conditions even more unbearable. During the flood season, many of the agricultural workers who supplemented the construction workforce returned to their farms to take advantage of the fertile silt deposited by the river. This meant the remaining workers had to take on additional responsibilities just when the working conditions were at their worst. The dry season brought its own problems. Water became even scarcer, food supplies ran low as stored grain was consumed, and the desert heat became literally deadly. Workers who had survived the winter and spring often succumbed to heat stroke during the brutal summer months. Sandstorms were another seasonal hazard that could shut down work for days at a time. The workers would huddle in their barracks while winds carrying tons of sand scarred the plateau and buried whatever progress had been made. After each storm, teams of workers had to clear sand from the work areas, repair damaged equipment, and resume construction of a monument that was slowly being reclaimed by the desert. The pyramid's massive scale meant that even small design changes or construction errors could have catastrophic consequences. A mistake in the foundation could require demolishing and rebuilding entire sections. An error in the internal passage layout could trap workers inside the structure or make it impossible to install the pharaoh's burial chamber. Quality control was maintained through a system of inspections and measurements that would make modern construction managers weep with envy. Every block was checked for proper dimensions and fit before being installed. The pyramid's internal passages were surveyed regularly to ensure they maintained the precise angles and dimensions specified in the architectural plans. But even with this attention to detail, mistakes happened. Blocks cracked under pressure and had to be replaced. Passages were carved in the wrong direction and had to be abandoned. Tools broke at critical moments, causing delays that rippled through the entire construction schedule. The master architects and engineers were under enormous pressure to maintain the construction timeline. The pharaoh's death could occur at any time, and the pyramid needed to be completed before that happened. An unfinished tomb was worse than no tomb at all, since it would be insufficient to ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife. This time pressure filtered down through every level of the workforce. Foremen pushed their crews harder, skilled craftsmen worked longer hours, and labourers were driven to the point of collapse in the race to complete each section of the pyramid before moving on to the next. The pyramid's internal chambers represented some of the most technically challenging construction in the entire project. The king's chamber, located deep inside the pyramid, required the installation of massive granite slabs that had to be transported through narrow passages and lifted into position with millimeter precision. The Grand Gallery, the sloped corridor that leads to the king's chamber, was an architectural marvel that required workers to install precisely fitted granite blocks while working in a space barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. The acoustic properties of the chamber suggest that the ancient engineers understood principles of sound reflection that wouldn't be formally recognized until modern times. But for the workers, the Grand Gallery was just another deadly obstacle to be overcome. The polished granite surfaces were slippery, the angles were treacherous, and a drop tool could easily kill someone working below. The installation of each block required coordinated effort from dozens of workers, any one of whom could cause a fatal accident through a moment of inattention. The pyramid's mortuary temple, connected to the main structure by a long causeway, required its own workforce and presented its own challenges. The temple walls were decorated with reliefs that required skilled artists and craftsmen, but the foundation work was just as back-breaking as the pyramid construction itself. The causeway connecting the mortuary temple to the pyramid was nearly half a mile long and had to be built to precise specifications to ensure proper alignment with the pyramid's entrance. This meant more stone hauling, more precision masonry, and more opportunities for workers to be crushed by falling blocks or injured by construction equipment. The entire complex, including the pyramid, temples, and associated structures, required an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks weighing a total of approximately 6 million tons. To put this in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to 30 modern aircraft carriers, except these blocks had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and installed using nothing but Bronze Age technology and human muscle power. The logistics of coordinating this massive construction project required a bureaucracy that employed thousands of scribes, accountants, and administrators. These officials lived in relative comfort compared to the workers, but they faced their own pressures to maintain accurate records and ensure efficient use of resources. The scribes recorded everything: how many blocks were quarried each day, how much food was distributed to each work gang, which workers were injured or killed, how much beer was consumed by each crew. These records were essential for planning and resource allocation, but they also created a paper trail that could be used to assign blame when things went wrong. The pressure to maintain productivity led to innovations in construction techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available technology. New methods were developed for moving massive blocks, for achieving precise fits between stones, and for maintaining structural stability as the pyramid rose to unprecedented heights. But innovation came at a cost measured in human lives. New techniques had to be tested on actual construction projects, often with fatal results for the workers involved. The knowledge gained from these experiments was invaluable for future projects, but it provided little comfort to the families of workers who died testing unproven construction methods. The pyramid's completion didn't end the workers' involvement with the project. The structure required ongoing maintenance to preserve its appearance and structural integrity. Teams of workers were permanently assigned to clean and repair the outer casing, maintain the internal passages, and protect the complex from vandalism and natural deterioration. This maintenance work was, in some ways, even more dangerous than the original construction. The pyramid surfaces became increasingly slippery as they were polished by wind and sand. The internal passages, carved from solid rock, developed cracks and structural weaknesses that could trap or crush unwary maintenance workers. The workers who survived the pyramid's construction faced an uncertain future. Their specialized skills were valuable for other construction projects, but the physical toll of pyramid building often left them unable to perform demanding labor. Many became supervisors or trainers for younger workers, passing on hard-won knowledge about the deadly art of moving massive stones. Some workers used their savings to return to their home villages and purchase small farms or workshops. But the vast majority had no savings to speak of, having spent their wages on basic survival during the construction years. They continued working on smaller construction projects until age or injury forced them to rely on their families or community charity. The families of workers who died during construction received minimal compensation, usually just enough to cover burial expenses and provide temporary support for widows and children. The concept of life insurance or worker compensation didn't exist. A worker's death was considered an unfortunate but acceptable cost of completing the pharaoh's eternal resting place. The legacy of the pyramid builders is complex and contradictory. They created one of the world's most impressive and enduring monuments, a structure that has inspired awe and wonder for over 400-500 years. Their technical achievements pushed the boundaries of human capability and established engineering principles that are still used today. But this legacy was built on a foundation of human suffering that is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. Thousands of workers gave their lives, their health, and their futures to build a monument that served no practical purpose beyond ensuring one man's successful journey to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid stands today as a testament to human ingenuity, determination, and engineering skill. It also stands as a reminder of what can be accomplished when human life is considered expendable and individual suffering is deemed acceptable in pursuit of larger goals. The workers who built the pyramid left few written records of their experiences. Most couldn't read or write, and those who could had little time or energy for recording their thoughts about the project that consumed their lives. Their story can only be pieced together from archaeological evidence, administrative records, and the enduring monument they created through decades of back-breaking labor. But the pyramid itself tells their story more eloquently than any written account could. Every block represents hours of quarrying, shaping, and installation by workers whose names are lost to history. Every passage bears the marks of tools wielded by hands that bled from the work. Every chamber echoes with the voices of men who died to create spaces they would never see completed. The Great Pyramid of Giza remains one of humanity's greatest achievements, a monument to the power of organized labor and engineering skill. It is also a monument to the thousands of anonymous workers who paid with their lives, their health, and their futures to build eternity's most expensive tomb. So the next time you see pictures of the Great Pyramid and marvel at its precision and grandeur, remember the men who built it. Remember that every perfectly fitted stone represents human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. Remember that this wonder of the ancient world was constructed by workers who lived in conditions that would be considered criminal today, who faced dangers that would shut down any modern construction project, and who died in numbers that would qualify as a humanitarian disaster. The pyramid builders didn't choose their fate. They were conscripted, coerced, or driven by desperation into service on the pharaoh's monument. They worked without modern tools, without safety equipment, without medical care, and without any hope that their sacrifices would be remembered or honored. They built eternity for someone else while their own lives were measured in backbreaking days and sleepless nights. Their monument has outlasted empires, religions, and civilizations. It has survived earthquakes, wars, and millennia of natural erosion. But the men who built it were forgotten almost as soon as the last block was set in place. The pyramid's completion was marked by elaborate ceremonies that celebrated the pharaoh's successful preparation for the afterlife. Priests conducted rituals, officials gave speeches, and the pharaoh himself probably made an appearance to bless the finished monument. But the workers who had spent decades building it weren't invited to the celebration. They were already being reassigned to other projects, or simply dismissed to find their own way in a world that had little use for men whose backs were broken and lungs were destroyed by royal ambition. The finished pyramid was a marvel of engineering precision that demonstrated humanity's ability to achieve the impossible through organized effort and applied determination. The base was leveled to within just 2.1 centimeters, an accuracy that would be impressive even with modern surveying equipment. The orientation was precise to within 3/60 of a degree, aligned almost perfectly with true north. The four sides were equal in length to within 20 millimeters, despite the massive scale of the construction. But these impressive statistics were achieved through human suffering that defies easy comprehension. Every millimeter of precision represented hours of additional labor by workers who were already pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Every degree of alignment required calculations and measurements performed by men working under conditions that made concentration nearly impossible. The pyramid's internal passages and chambers were even more precisely constructed than the exterior. The ascending passage maintains a constant angle of 26 degrees, 18 minutes throughout its entire length. The Grand Gallery's corbelled ceiling rises in 7 courses, each one precisely calculated to distribute the enormous weight of the stone above, while maintaining the structural integrity of the passage. These achievements required mathematical and engineering knowledge that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries, but they also required workers who could translate theoretical precision into physical reality using primitive tools and methods. The men who actually built these precisely engineered spaces worked by lamplight in cramped, dusty conditions that made every measurement a challenge and every installation a potential death sentence. The King's Chamber itself represents perhaps the greatest technical achievement of the entire project. The chamber is lined with enormous granite blocks that were quarried hundreds of miles away in Aswan, transported down the Nile on barges, then hauled across the desert and lifted into position deep inside the pyramid. Each block weighs several tons and had to be fitted with tolerances measured in millimeters. But the workers who installed these massive granite slabs saw none of the chamber's finished glory. They worked in darkness, surrounded by half-completed stonework, breathing air thick with granite dust and the smoke from oil lamps. They knew they were creating something important, but they couldn't step back and admire their work the way modern visitors can. The pyramid's casing stones, which originally gave the structure its smooth, gleaming appearance, required perhaps the highest level of craftsmanship of any element in the construction. Each casing block was precisely angled to maintain the pyramid's geometric perfection while fitting seamlessly with its neighbors. The outer surface was polished to a mirror finish that could be seen for miles across the desert. The workers who shaped and installed these casing stones were the most skilled craftsmen on the project, but they were also the most expendable. A single mistake in cutting or placing a casing block could ruin the appearance of an entire section of the pyramid, and such mistakes were not tolerated. Workers who consistently failed to meet the exacting standards were replaced by others who might have better luck maintaining the precision required for pharaonic perfection. Most of the original casing stones have since been removed and used for other construction projects, but the few that remain demonstrate the incredible skill of the ancient craftsmen. The joints between stones are so tight that they're nearly invisible, and the surface finish is smooth enough to reflect light like polished metal. Achieving this level of quality required tools and techniques that pushed Bronze Age technology to its absolute limits. The workers who created these masterpieces of stone cutting had no formal training in the modern sense. They learned their skills through apprenticeship systems that passed knowledge from master to student over generations. But apprenticeship on a pyramid construction site wasn't like learning a craft in a comfortable workshop. Students learned their skills while working on an active construction site where mistakes could be fatal and the pressure to maintain productivity was constant. The toolmakers who supported the construction effort faced their own set of challenges. Bronze tools required constant maintenance and replacement, but the raw materials were expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain. Copper had to be imported from mines in the Sinai Peninsula. Tin came from even more distant sources, and the fuel needed for smelting put additional strain on already limited resources. The workshops, where tools were made and repaired, operated around the clock to keep the construction crews supplied with functional equipment. Master metalworkers supervised teams of apprentices who worked bellows, maintained fires, and performed the dozens of specialized tasks required to turn raw metal into precision tools. But even the most skilled metalworkers couldn't overcome the fundamental limitations of Bronze Age technology. Bronze tools were simply not ideal for working hard stone, and the constant need to repair and replace them created bottlenecks that slowed the entire construction process. Workers often had to wait for tools to be repaired or sharpened, losing valuable time that could never be recovered. The quarries that supplied stone for the pyramid were industrial operations in their own right, employing thousands of workers who faced hazards that were different from, but no less deadly than those on the construction site. Quarrying involved splitting massive blocks of stone from bedrock using copper tools and wooden wedges, a process that could send tons of stone crashing down without warning. The quarry workers developed techniques for reading the stone, identifying natural fracture lines and weaknesses that could be exploited to extract blocks with minimal waste. This knowledge was gained through experience that was often, literally, bought with blood, as workers learned to recognize dangerous conditions only after seeing their colleagues crushed by falling stone. Transportation of quarried blocks from the quarries to the construction site required another army of workers who specialized in moving massive weights across difficult terrain. The blocks were loaded onto wooden sleds using ramps, levers, and sheer human strength, then dragged across the desert by teams of men who had to coordinate their efforts with military precision. The roads used for transporting stone blocks had to be carefully maintained to prevent the massive weights from becoming mired in sand or damaged by rough terrain. Teams of workers were assigned full, time-to-road maintenance, smoothing ruts, clearing obstacles, and reinforcing weak sections that might collapse under the weight of passing stone sleds. Water transport offered some advantages for moving the heaviest blocks. but it also created new challenges. Barges had to be specially constructed to handle loads that would sink normal vessels, and the loading and unloading process required specialized equipment and techniques that were still being developed as the project progressed. The Nile's seasonal flooding complicated water transport by changing river levels and current patterns throughout the year. Barge crews had to adjust their routes and timing to account for these changes, sometimes waiting weeks for favorable conditions before attempting to move particularly heavy or valuable loads. The administrative challenge of coordinating all these interconnected operations required a bureaucracy that was unprecedented in scale and complexity. Scribes tracked thousands of individual workers, monitored the progress of dozens of specialized work crews, and maintained detailed records of resource consumption and project timelines. But administration, no matter how sophisticated, couldn't solve the fundamental problem of human limitations. Workers had finite strength, limited endurance, and inconvenient tendencies to become sick, injured, or dead when pushed beyond their capabilities. The administrators could plan and organize and record, but they couldn't change the basic reality that the pyramid was being built by human beings who were slowly being destroyed by the work. The medical personnel who supported the construction effort worked under conditions that would challenge modern emergency room doctors. They dealt with traumatic injuries from falling blocks, crushing accidents, heat stroke, respiratory problems from stone dust, and countless other ailments that were direct results of the working conditions. Ancient Egyptian medicine was surprisingly sophisticated in some areas, but it was helpless against many of the conditions that plagued pyramid workers. Silicosis, the lung disease caused by inhaling stone dust, was incurable with available treatments. Chronic malnutrition weakened workers' immune systems and made them vulnerable to diseases that might not have been fatal under better conditions. The healers did what they could with available resources, but their primary function was often simply to determine which workers might recover enough to return to their duties and which ones should be written off as casualties. Trade on a pyramid construction site meant deciding who was worth the investment of limited medical supplies and who should be left to die as efficiently as possible. Pain management was primitive and largely ineffective. Workers suffering from chronic injuries had to choose between working in agony or facing starvation if they couldn't perform their assigned duties. Opium was available but expensive, reserved for the most severe cases or workers whose specialized skills made them worth the investment in expensive painkillers. The psychological support available to workers was limited to whatever comfort could be provided by religious rituals and community solidarity. The concept of mental health as distinct from spiritual well-being didn't exist, and workers suffering from what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress were expected to find strength through prayer and willpower. The isolation of the construction site created additional psychological pressures for workers who were separated from their families and communities for years at a time. Letters were expensive and difficult to arrange, assuming the workers could read and write in the first place. Most workers had no contact with their previous lives, beyond the occasional message carried by traders or traveling officials. The workers' village developed its own social structures and cultural practices that helped mitigate some of the psychological stress of the construction work. Work gangs formed close bonds that provided mutual support and protection, and informal leaders emerged who could represent workers' interests to the official hierarchy. Religious observances were particularly important for maintaining morale and providing some sense of meaning to the deadly work. Workers made offerings to gods associated with protection and craftsmanship, participated in festivals that broke the monotony of the construction routine, and found comfort in beliefs about the afterlife that gave significance to their suffering. But religion could also be a source of additional pressure and guilt. Workers were constantly reminded that they were participating in a sacred project that would ensure the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife and maintain Egypt's cosmic balance. Failure to work hard enough or maintain proper dedication wasn't just laziness, it was a religious failing that could have consequences for the entire kingdom. The seasonal rhythms of Egyptian agriculture created additional complications for the construction project. Many workers were farmers who could only work on the pyramid during the flood season when their fields were underwater. This meant the workforce fluctuated dramatically throughout the year, requiring constant adjustment of work schedules and resource allocation. The temporary workers who joined the project during agricultural off-seasons were often less skilled and more accident-prone than the permanent construction crews. They required additional supervision and training, but they also provided essential labor during peak construction periods when the permanent workforce wasn't sufficient to meet project deadlines. Integrating temporary and permanent workers created social tensions within the workers' village. Permanent workers resented having to train and supervise newcomers who might not be committed to the project long term. Temporary workers felt excluded from the established social hierarchies and often received less favorable treatment from foremen and administrators. The construction project's enormous appetite for resources created economic disruptions throughout the Egyptian kingdom. The demand for food, tools, and raw materials drove up prices and created shortages that affected civilians who had no connection to the pyramid project. Farmers were required to sell a portion of their harvest to feed the construction workforce, often at prices set by government officials rather than market forces. Craftsmen found their materials commandeered for pyramid construction, forcing them to suspend their own projects or seek alternative supplies at higher costs. The transportation network required to supply the construction site appropriated boats, pack animals, and vehicles that might otherwise have been used for civilian commerce. Trade routes were disrupted as resources were diverted to support the pharaoh's monument, creating ripple effects throughout the Egyptian economy. Local communities near the construction site were overwhelmed by the sudden presence of thousands of workers who required food, water, medical care, and other services that the existing infrastructure wasn't designed to provide. Villages that had supported a few hundred residents suddenly found themselves trying to accommodate work crews that outnumbered the local population. The environmental impact of pyramid construction was severe and long-lasting. The quarrying operations stripped away vast amounts of rock and limestone, leaving scars in the landscape that are still visible today. The constant traffic of workers, animals, and equipment degraded large areas around the construction site. Water consumption for the project put enormous pressure on local sources, requiring the diversion of streams and the construction of additional wells and reservoirs. The waste produced by 20 Zalozan workers and their supporting infrastructure created sanitation problems that affected the health of everyone in the area. The forests that provided wood for tools, sleds, and construction equipment were harvested faster than they could regenerate, creating shortages that forced the procurement of materials from increasingly distant sources. The fuel requirements for metalworking, cooking, and other necessary activities consumed additional wood and other organic materials. The noise and dust produced by construction activities made large areas around the pyramid uninhabitable for normal human occupation. The constant pounding of hammers, the scraping of stone sleds, and the shouting of work crews created a din that could be heard for miles across the desert. As the pyramid neared completion, the focus shifted from construction to finishing work that required even greater precision and skill than the basic structural elements. The internal chambers had to be fitted with architectural details, the passages had to be finished to precise specifications, and the exterior had to be polished to the mirror, like perfection that befitted a pharaoh's eternal resting place. This finishing work was performed by the most skilled craftsmen on the project, men who had spent years learning their trades and proving their ability to work to the exacting standards required for royal construction. But skill didn't protect them from the dangers inherent in working inside a structure that was still settling and adjusting to its enormous weight. The pyramid's massive weight caused ongoing structural adjustments that created new hazards for workers finishing the interior spaces. Stone blocks shifted slightly as they settled into their final positions, creating gaps that had to be filled and surfaces that had to be re-smoothed to maintain the required precision. The internal passages, carved from solid rock and lined with fitted stones, developed cracks and irregularities that required constant attention from maintenance crews. Workers had to crawl through narrow, dark passages to perform repairs that often involved removing and replacing blocks that weighed several tons. The ventilation shafts that provided air circulation to the internal chambers were marvels of engineering that required precise calculation of angles and dimensions to function properly. But for the workers who carved these shafts, they represented additional dangers in an already hazardous environment. The shafts had to maintain exact angles over distances of hundreds of feet, requiring survey techniques that pushed the boundaries of available technology. Workers carved these passages while suspended in narrow shafts, working by lamplight in air that was often barely breathable due to stone dust and inadequate ventilation. The precision required for the pyramid's internal features meant that mistakes were not just costly, but potentially catastrophic. An error in the angle of a passage could make it impossible to install the pharaoh's sarcophagus. A mistake in the dimensions of a chamber could compromise the structural integrity of the entire pyramid. Quality control for the interior work was even more rigorous than for the exterior construction. Every surface was checked for proper finish. Every angle was verified with primitive but effective measuring instruments, and every joint was inspected to ensure it met the standards appropriate for a king's eternal resting place. But this attention to quality came at a cost measured in human suffering. Workers who failed to meet the required standards were replaced, often after being punished for their inadequacy. The pressure to achieve perfection drove workers to take risks that frequently proved fatal. The final stages of construction involved installing the pyramid's capstone, the small pyramid-shaped block that crowned the entire structure. This capstone, probably made of granite or basalt and possibly covered with gold or electrum, represented the completion of the pharaoh's monument and the culmination of decades of human effort. Lifting the capstone into position required all the engineering skill and coordination that had been developed during the construction process. The block had to be raised nearly 500 feet above ground level and positioned with absolute precision to complete the pyramid's geometric perfection. The installation of the capstone was probably accompanied by religious ceremonies that celebrated the completion of the pharaoh's eternal resting place and blessed all those who had participated in its construction. But for the workers who had actually built the pyramid, the completion meant the end of employment and an uncertain future. The skilled craftsmen who had worked on the pyramid could probably find employment on other construction projects, assuming their health permitted continued labor. Their specialized knowledge of large-scale stone construction was valuable, and they might even be called upon to supervise similar projects in other parts of Egypt or neighboring kingdoms. But the laborers who had done the back-breaking work of hauling and lifting stone blocks faced a grimmer future. Their bodies were broken by years of heavy labor, and their lungs were damaged by stone dust, and their only marketable skill was the ability to move massive weights under conditions that had permanently damaged their health. Many former pyramid workers probably returned to their home villages to live on whatever family support was available, contributing what they could to household economies while slowly dying from the long-term effects of their construction work. Others may have continued working on smaller projects until age or disability forced them into destitution. The administrative records that tracked workers' contributions during construction were probably discarded or filed away in archives, where they would eventually crumble into dust. The names and achievements of individual workers were not considered important enough to preserve, and the scribes who had recorded their daily activities moved on to other projects. The families of workers who died during construction received no ongoing support from the government or the pharaoh's estate. A worker's death was considered an unfortunate but acceptable cost of completing the royal monument, and his family was expected to manage their grief and economic hardship without assistance. The workers' cemetery, located near the construction site, filled up with the bodies of men who had given their lives to build Pharaoh's pyramid. These graves were marked with simple stones or pottery vessels, nothing that would identify the deceased or commemorate their contributions to one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. Archaeological excavations of the workers' cemetery have revealed the physical toll of pyramid construction more clearly than any written record could. Skeletons show evidence of repetitive stress injuries, chronic malnutrition, and traumatic injuries that suggest lives of constant physical hardship. The age at death for pyramid workers was significantly lower than for other segments of Egyptian society, and the pattern of injuries suggests that workers who survived the most dangerous jobs often succumbed to the cumulative effects of years of brutal labor. The cemetery also contains the remains of children and women who lived in the workers' village, evidence of the families who shared in the hardships of pyramid construction without directly participating in the building process. These family members faced their own dangers from the unsanitary conditions, inadequate food supplies, and medical neglect that characterized life in the construction camp. The Great Pyramid stands today as a monument to human achievement that continues to inspire awe and wonder in visitors from around the world. Its mathematical precision, architectural sophistication, and sheer scale represent capabilities that seem almost superhuman from our modern perspective. But the pyramid is also a monument to human suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Every block represents hours of back-breaking labor by workers whose names are lost to history. Every precisely fitted joint required skills that were learned through trial and error that often proved fatal for the workers involved. The tourists who visit the pyramid today see a triumph of ancient engineering, a testament to the organizational capabilities of pharaonic Egypt, and a symbol of humanity's ability to create lasting monuments through coordinated effort. They don't see the thousands of workers who died to create this wonder, the families who were destroyed by the economic and social costs of construction, or the communities that were disrupted by the project's enormous resource requirements. The pyramid's interior chambers, which visitors can explore through guided tours, were carved and built by workers who never lived to see them completed. The passages were crawled through by men who worked in darkness and died young from lung diseases caused by stone dust and inadequate ventilation. The precision that visitors admire was achieved by workers who were beaten for making mistakes, who worked without safety equipment in conditions that would be illegal in any modern construction project, and who had no choice but to continue working until they died or became too disabled to continue. The Great Pyramid has inspired countless theories about ancient technologies, lost civilizations, and extraterrestrial intervention. These theories persist partly because it seems impossible that such a perfect structure could have been built using primitive tools and ancient construction methods. But the pyramid was built by human beings using Bronze Age technology, and the evidence for this is overwhelming. The tools have been found, the quarries have been located, the workers' villages have been excavated, and the cemetery has been studied. What seems impossible is not the technology, but the human cost that ancient Egyptian society was willing to accept to build Pharaoh's monument. The workers who built the Great Pyramid were not aliens or members of a lost advanced civilization. They were ordinary human beings who were forced by economic necessity, legal obligation, or social pressure to participate in a construction project that consumed their lives and health in service of royal vanity. Their achievement was real and lasting, but it came at a price that no modern society would consider acceptable. The Great Pyramid is a wonder of the ancient world, but it is also a reminder of what can be accomplished when human life is considered expendable and individual suffering is deemed acceptable in pursuit of monumentally selfish goals. The pyramid builders deserve to be remembered not just as anonymous contributors to Pharaoh's glory, but as individuals who paid with their lives, their health, and their futures to create something that would outlast empires. Their names are lost, but their sacrifice is written in stone in every block of the Great Pyramid of Giza.